There is a persistent misconception about the Korean War, that it was fought primarily with steel, artillery and air power, and that survival hinged on supply chains and fire superiority alone. What tends to be overlooked is how often the war was decided by something far more primitive, the ability to endure cold, scarcity and time itself. In the northern sectors, especially during the winters of 1950 and 1951, the difference between units that held and those that broke often came down to a quiet, nearly forgotten material practice, one that turned ordinary, soft timber into something approaching stone, not through industrial chemistry, but through patience, environment, and method. It is a technique with roots far older than the war, but it resurfaced there under pressure, and it offers a lesson that extends well beyond that frozen peninsula. The war in the north was, honestly, as much a battle against climate as it was against an enemy. By late 1950, United Nations forces had advanced deep into North Korea, actually approaching the Yalu River. The assumption was that the conflict was, nearing its end. What followed instead was a reversal shaped not only by the intervention of Chinese forces, but by the terrain and weather that accompanied them. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, often reaching -30 degrees Celsius in exposed regions. Equipment failed, lubricants thickened, batteries died. But more critically, infrastructure, roads, shelters, and defensive positions became liabilities if they were not adapted to the cold. In these conditions, the distinction between hardwood and softwood, between treated and untreated timber, became significant in ways that conventional military planning had not fully accounted for. Softwoods, abundant in the northern forests, were easier to cut and transport. But they warped, cracked and rotted quickly when exposed to cycles of freezing and thawing. Yet some units, particularly those drawing from local knowledge or improvising under necessity, began using methods that fundamentally altered the properties of this material. What appears to be simple timber can be transformed through controlled exposure and time. The method itself was not new. Variations of it had been practiced for centuries across northern Europe and parts of Asia. In essence, it involved a controlled process of saturating wood with water, then allowing it to freeze and thaw repeatedly under pressure, often while partially buried or constrained within earthworks. In some cases, the wood was also charred lightly before exposure, sealing its outer layers. What this achieved was not true petrification, of course, but a form of densification and stabilization. The cellular structure of the wood would compress and reorganize as moisture expanded and contracted within it. Resins would harden. The outer layers, especially if charred, became resistant to rot and insects. Over time, the timber took on properties that made it significantly more durable, less prone to warping, and more resistant to environmental degradation. In the context of the Korean War, this process was, accelerated by necessity. Timber used in bunkers, trench supports, and makeshift fortifications was deliberately exposed to the elements in ways that, under normal circumstances, would be considered destructive. But in the sustained cold of the northern winter, these exposures actually became part of the treatment itself. Improvised fortifications revealed the limits of conventional military engineering. Standard military engineering at the time relied heavily on prefabricated materials, steel reinforcements, and rapid construction techniques. These worked well in temperate environments or, honestly, where supply lines were stable. In Korea's northern regions, however, those assumptions broke down. Steel became brittle in extreme cold. Concrete, if not properly mixed and cured, cracked under freeze-thaw stress. Supply lines were stretched thin, making replacement materials scarce. Units that adapted by using locally sourced timber and by treating it through these environmental methods found that their positions lasted longer with less maintenance. Trench walls held. Roof supports resisted collapse under snow load. Defensive structures blended more effectively into the terrain, reducing visibility from the air. This was not a formal doctrine. It was an accumulation of field decisions, often undocumented, sometimes passed informally between units or learned from local populations who had long understood how to work with the climate rather than against it. The human dimension of these methods is often overlooked, but, it's actually deeply instructive. What stands out in accounts from soldiers and engineers is not just the ingenuity of the method, but the mindset it required. It demanded patience in a context that honestly usually rewarded speed. It required a willingness to let materials sit, to allow environmental processes to take effect, even when time felt really scarce. It also required observation, an understanding of how wood behaved over days and weeks under specific conditions. In a war often characterized by rapid advances and sudden reversals, this slower, more deliberate approach to construction and survival created pockets of resilience. Units that invested time in preparing their shelters and defenses in this way were better able to endure prolonged exposure, reducing casualties not from enemy fire but from frostbite, collapse, and exhaustion. There is, a broader lesson here about preparedness. Modern systems, they tend to prioritize immediacy and efficiency, but under stress, especially environmental stress, those priorities can actually become liabilities. The northern method of treating wood during the Korean War, it really illustrates how resilience often depends on aligning with natural processes rather than, trying to override them. These overlooked practices quietly influenced later military and survival thinking. While the method itself did not become a formalized part of military engineering manuals, its underlying principles did in fact influence later approaches to cold weather operations. Armies began to place greater emphasis on environmental adaptation, on the use of local materials, and on the importance of understanding terrain and climate at a granular level. Survival training programs, particularly those developed during the later stages of the Cold War, incorporated lessons that echoed these experiences. The idea that materials could be improved through exposure rather than protection, that durability could be achieved through process rather than substitution, became part of a broader philosophy of fieldcraft. Even outside the military, similar principles have found applications in architecture and sustainable building practices. Techniques such as wood charring, controlled weathering, and the use of natural cycles to enhance material properties have gained renewed attention in recent years. What was once a matter of necessity in wartime has become, in some contexts, a matter of design and sustainability. What this reveals about the Korean War is not just how it was fought, but how it was endured. The dominant narratives of the Korean War tend to focus on major offensives, political decisions, and the broader geopolitical stakes. These are important, but they can obscure the day-to-day realities that shape the outcomes on the ground. The war was, in many ways, a test of endurance, of systems, of materials, and of people. The forgotten northern method of transforming soft wood into something far more durable is a small part of that story, but it is a telling one. It highlights how adaptation often occurs at the margins, in the spaces where formal doctrine has not yet reached. It really shows how knowledge, especially local, practical knowledge, can become absolutely decisive when the pressure is on. And honestly, it reminds us that resilience is rarely the product of just one single innovation. It's actually the accumulation of small, often overlooked practices that together make survival possible. Understanding these details does more than just fill gaps in the historical record. It actually changes how we think about conflict, about preparation, and about the relationship between human systems and the environments in which they operate. So, if you found this perspective valuable, go ahead and subscribe to History Vault for more in-depth explorations of the overlooked aspects of history. And, share this video with others who are ready to look beyond the surface.